Nous allons passer au troisième et dernier exposé oral, a cerebral approach, recognizing the link between intimate partner violence and traumatic brain injury among paramedics could ease detriment to survivors. Présentation qui nous serait offerte par Rory Marshall de l'Université de Colombie-Britannique, Okanagan. The final lighting oral for this morning is by Rory Marshall of the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. Rory will be presenting a cerebral approach, recognizing the link between intimate partner violence and traumatic brain injury among paramedics could ease detriment to survivors.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. My name is Rory Marshall, and I'm a paramedic for BCEHS and AHS EMS, and a PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. And thank you for joining us on Zoom again. I know a lot of you are probably taking the call from home today. I know I am. I'm sitting in my living room, feeling comfortable, enjoying it, having a coffee. It's nice and early here on the West Coast. But unfortunately for a lot of our patients, home isn't always a safe and comforting place. Intimate partner violence, commonly known as domestic violence, is a really prevalent problem. This is physical, psychological, sexual, and stalking-like behaviors perpetrated by a current or former intimate partner. And a big goal there in this kind of violence is to exert power and control. So this violence is super prevalent, with a lifetime prevalence among women of about 30%. And about 10% in the last 12 months. So 1 in 3 and 1 in 10 respectively. Both those numbers are likely underreported and likely underestimated. Now, violence, intimate partner violence specifically, is also cyclic in nature. So it follows this 4-phase pattern and is often escalating. So if allowed to, will progress mild, moderate, severe, and often towards death. Now, an area of intimate partner violence that is underinvestigated is intimate partner violence caused brain injury. Intimate partner violence, in its physical sense, targets the head, neck, and face. Now, if you're thinking about that as a mechanism on scene, you're looking at direct blows, strangulation, any other vicious act that can target the head, neck, and face. That's what's commonly being perpetrated. So it makes sense, targeting the head, neck, and face, you're going to sustain a lot of brain injuries, with that prevalence of brain injury being between 70 and 90% in cases of physical IPV. So if we think about the reoccurring nature of violence, reoccurring brain injuries, right? 1, 2, and we know this has negative effects on healing and recovery, and that can have long-term health consequences. So as our paramedic response, we're starting way back behind the 8 ball. In Canada, we have no educational standard to even acknowledge or understand intimate partner violence. We have no vocational standard, so nothing that's desired from paramedics in these situations, and no guidance. So no direction where to take these calls. As that goes for our patients, we have a limited IPV response. Is it person dependent? Does it depend on their familiarity? Does it depend on their lived experience? And we don't know. There's a lot of questions in this area. So thinking about that lived experience, we ask the question, does gender have an influence on knowledge of intimate partner violence and intimate partner violence caused brain injury as a component of lived experience? How we got at this? We did an online survey using a 7-point Likert scale. We looked at a population of Western Canadian paramedics. We examined IPV knowledge and IPV-BI knowledge, and then looked at both between groups, so between men and women, and within that group, differences in the two knowledge bases. So our respondents were predominantly cisgender, Caucasian, about 40 years old, working in metro areas, full-time paramedics, 14 years of service on average, and with similar educational and work experiences between groups. So getting right into the data, this is outlining between gender knowledge of IPV. So women on the top there, men on the bottom, 1 indicating the lowest possible knowledge score, 7 indicating the highest. And you can see that women on the top scored average score of 6.1, men scored an average score of 5.9, and that difference between groups was statistically significant, showcasing a medium positive effect. Now, if we look at IPV-BI knowledge, again, women on the top line there, men on the bottom, 1 worst possible score, 7 best possible score. Women scored 4.6, men scored 4.2. the difference between those two scores among groups was significant, showcasing a medium positive effect. And you can see both those scores are relatively close, and the functional impact of that knowledge gap is up for debate. So we wanted to look at a few other things as well. Now, within our group, so this is within the group of self-identified women, we wanted to look at IPV knowledge compared to IPV brain injury knowledge to look at that situational gap. And our IPV score of 6.1, IPV knowledge score for women 4.6. The difference between groups there is statistically significant, but now with a large positive effect, so a really substantial gap between those two scores. This result was mirrored in our group of men. Again, IPV scoring 5.9, IPV-BI knowledge 4.2, statistically significant, and a large positive effect. So a really big difference between IPV knowledge and IPV-BI knowledge between women and men. So some thoughts surrounding this. Yes, women were more knowledgeable than men in both areas. They have similar paramedic experiences, they being both our groups. They have similar backgrounds in education, but their knowledge differences we were seeing in IPV are likely from lived experience as women or men, more so than anything else. Now, a big gap in both groups is that perception that IPV is not related to brain injury. Now, as paramedics, we have this opportunity to intervene in that cycle of violence. And if we can provide, if we can recognize IPV and then IPV-caused brain injury, we can intervene and hopefully break or support our survivors that are engaged in that cycle of violence and hopefully lead them to better outcomes. So if you've fallen asleep because it's early or late, depending on where you are, take home only this one slide today. Women showed better knowledge of IPV and IPV-BI versus men in our study. There is a disconnect among paramedics in general between IPV and brain injury that we must establish to proceed in this area. Paramedics need education, training, and infrastructure to support this change. And there's a huge opportunity for us as paramedics to become a gold star resource for survivors of IPV and IPV-BI. Now, if we think about that cycle of violence one more time, if we can intervene as paramedics and disrupt that cycle of violence and get better health outcomes for survivors, we've got a much better chance at making them feel safe at home and able to live happy and healthy lives. That's what I'd like to see out of this today. Thank you so much for having me, and best of luck with the rest of the day. Thank you.
This abstract is open for questions. Good morning, Rory.
Morning.
We have a question from Jeff Maxim. Great presentation, Rory. What should be our first priority in educating paramedics?
Sorry, that's a really good question. Thanks, Jeff. Intimate partner violence is a really complex issue. There's a whole lot of different components, but I think just understanding how common intimate partner violence is and the long-term health effects and what that means to paramedic practice would be a really great place to start. So how functionally knowing that there's a really high rate of intimate partner violence and then how that affects our practice would be the key priority, and then expanding through to, okay, and how do we manage cases involving intimate partner violence to support the best possible outcome we have with the resources we have for our patients. I think that would be a good place to start, but ideally need a few hours to get into that one.
Unfortunately, we do not have a few hours. In fact, we don't even have time for a second question. Rory, thank you. You have a comment in the Q&A there. I imagine, based on past experience, the questions will start to appear as soon as we go into the next presentation. I will thank you for your time, Rory, and thank you for your important research.
Sounds good. Thanks, Luke.